It's moi says, for borrowed foreign words, do you pronounce in the original language or just best guess? Now, this is a great question because it's a global society that we have, right? And we hear words all the time from other countries that we may not know how to say. So what do you do when you hear that? Do you say it how you think you should say it, just sort of guess? Or do you try to figure out how do they say it? How do local people say it? And this actually gets a little bit complicated depending on where you're from. And I'll give you a quick example. So, Japanese. Japanese developed on its own and then borrowed later on, and as I understand it, they developed a lot of the written language called kanji of Japanese from China. So it's not that the language itself originated from China, but that they borrowed that for writing, and it was housewives in Japan who began to borrow it and use it for the writing system, part of the writing system, right? I believe that was when they started using kanji. I could be wrong about that. I'm not an expert on Japanese. But the point there is, because the characters are shared between China and Japan, many people in China will not know the Japanese pronunciation of, for example, a city name. And so, while maybe I would say, oh, that city is Tokyo, or that's Fukuoka, or that's Nagoya, or whatever it happens to be, I would say it not too far from the way that it's pronounced in Japan, with maybe my American accent added to it. Someone from China would say something completely different based on the Chinese pronunciation of those Chinese characters, because it's originally from Chinese. So that gets really confusing, right? So, but we don't need to talk about that really, because what we're talking about is English. Now, first we have to sort of define what a borrowed word is, because English is something like 10 to 15% Nordic. It's basically a Germanic language, which is related to German, but not German. German and English are cousins. English has a major influence from Old French because the Norman invasion that happened in the, 1066? Is that right? Is that when it happened? The Norman invasion came over, and then that brought a bunch of French over to the English language. So when we say things like chandelier and ballet and a bunch of other words, including common everyday items like beef, which comes from French, we have these borrowed words that become the language. So first, how do you define it? Now, I think the point of It's Moi's question is to say modern borrowed words. So the old French words get grandfathered into it, and we say, oh, okay, beef is an English word. It's not a French word. Beef is an English word. All right, I will give you that, because if we say that words like beef are actually French words and that's a borrowed word, then we have to go all the way back to the history, and it becomes this project, and we have to start writing papers about this. We have to start writing philology papers, and it gets very complicated. So let's talk about what I think you're talking about, which is more modern English words, or modern words rather, that are borrowed. Now, I mentioned the example of Japan. So we don't have anything between, let's say, the United States and Japan that would confuse it, other than our own dialect and the way that we move our mouths. And so when I say something like anime, right, I'm talking about a particular thing, a cartoon, an animated TV show or series from Japan, and that's what it means in Japan too. And I'm using something that comes from the Japanese pronunciation and is probably pretty close, because I have no reason not to do that, right? But then there are other things, because the sounds are a little harder in the original language, where it does get changed a little bit. And I'll give you a simple example. In English, we say, instead of the Chinese pronunciation, which is gong fu, gong is not a sound that we have in English, so we say kung fu. Kung fu. Another simple example of a borrowed word from Chinese would be something like tofu, right? We all know tofu. Now, I think it's originally from China, but you guys can check me on that. But let's say it is, okay? Now, do people in China say tofu? No, they say tofu, right? Okay, it's a different pronunciation. So we have sort of Englishized the pronunciation of that, and that becomes the standard pronunciation in America of that. And you can't say that it's wrong because that's just how Americans say it. So you have these sort of two types where some of them, like Toyota, are just slight American accents of the original thing. And some of them are completely changed, or at least with letters changed, from the original because we don't have that sound, right? We don't have that sound that's in Kung Fu. We don't have that, so we say Kung Fu in a very American way. And that's generally how it works. I use those examples because that's what comes to mind for me, but there are tons of words that come from various languages, right? And let's say one from Europe. Okay, so kindergarten is a German word. Now, do German people say exactly in the same way that Americans do kindergarten? No, and I'm not going to try it because my German is not good, but it's definitely something like kindergarten. It's like a garten sound, I think. I could be wrong, so correct me. But it's more like that than garden. Sometimes we say garden, sometimes we say garden, right? So it's definitely different in the way that we say it. Now, can we say, that is how you say it? No, we can say, that's how Americans say it. And then you can say, well, it's been in the language so long, it's not really a borrowed word. Again, that line is very fuzzy. Okay, so my suggestion would be to decide who you're going to communicate with on a daily basis and learn that pronunciation. If you're mostly going to be communicating with native English speakers and English is what you're trying to improve, I would recommend just learning the way that British people or Americans or Australians or Canadians say these words, even if those words are not the original way that those are pronounced. Because that's not how language works. We don't whip out our books and say, oh, well, let me check the pronunciation of that one. No, Americans say it this way. British people say it that way. And that's not only true for borrowed words, but for words that we consider to be in the language. Right? We always disagree with people in England about how to say aluminum. We say aluminum in America, they say aluminium. Aluminium, aluminum. And we fight each other. We throw eggs at each other over this debate. Right? But the reality is they say aluminium and we say aluminum, and that's just it. Language is this slowly flowing, evolutionary, naturalistic, artistic type thing that changes constantly from generation to generation. So the question that you should ask here is, what do you want to learn? Who are you going to be communicating with most? And it might be an interesting idea to try to learn both pronunciations. I find joy in learning both pronunciations. I like to know that Kung Fu is said in America and Gong Fu is said in China. I like to know that. It's interesting to me, right? And the Japanese example I gave, Japanese has fewer phonemes than English. Phonemes are the basic sounds in words in a language. I think English has 44. Japanese has fewer. So they cannot say things that we say in English, but they have versions of those words for Japan, versions of English words. So if you're going to be mostly communicating with Japanese speakers, you're going to have to learn words like interneto, which means internet in Japanese. It's based on the English, right? A lot of the sounds, or the words rather, for modern things like internet and a lot of other different things, come from English and are changed into, I think it's the katakana characters that are used for that. And it sounds kind of like that. And so you could say, oh, no, that's wrong. No, that's not wrong. That's just how Japanese people say it. So if you're going to be communicating with Japanese speakers, then you need to know those pronunciations. It's all based on the context and the situation. And I know I've talked too much about this, but that's the basic idea. First, ask yourself, who are you going to communicate with? And that should answer your question for you. All right, guys. Well, good question. If you haven't already, make sure you hit the like button. That would be awesome. Don't forget to subscribe. Check out my full English courses in the links in the description. Awesome one.